Hello. I'm going to start the family lecture. This week is filled with material that I think is core to our department as a group of sociologists and also core to the discipline. And I just wanted to say a few words about the fact that our department is one of the preeminent departments in the entire world as far as family sociology and family demography. We have two research centers, the Center for Family and Demographic Research, and there's only one of 17 of its kind in the United States. And then we have the National Center for Family and Marriage Research. And that one is a presidentially appointed research center, and it's the only one of its kind in the world. And so we have a lot of opportunities through those two centers for undergraduates who want to do research or do internships, so you might consider that. At any rate, in this lecture, I'm going to talk to you about some of the major trends in families. So I'm giving you kind of a demographic overview. And I'll conclude the lecture by looking specifically at generations of millennials, so people who are turning young adult and who are very young adult right now. So I think that's many of you. Okay, so the big trends, and you should know these trends very well for the exam, are that we're seeing a delay in forming marriages. The younger people are putting off marriage into later and later ages. And so, for example, now age at marriage, the average age at marriage for men is around 29, and for women it's around 27 and even a little bit higher than that. We also are experiencing an increase in cohabitation. And so now the majority of people will cohabit before they marry. And then after marriage, if they divorce, as many as three-fourths of them will cohabit before they remarry, if they remarry at all. And this has been kind of a radical change since like the 50s and 60s. We've also seen the growth in single parenting, and the single parenting phenomenon is still increasing. We know that the vast majority of single parent families are headed by mothers, but the fastest growing kind of single parenthood is headed by fathers. So we're seeing fatherhood, single fathering, as a kind of a new trend that's emerging. We're also seeing the steady increase in women's labor force participation. And it's not just that women are working, but now women are looking more and more like they're having the career trajectories of men. So not only are they entering the labor force and pursuing the same types of jobs as men, or trying to, but they're likely to be working full time when they can, just like men, and they're becoming less likely to be leaving the labor force for as long periods of time when their children are born. And in fact, to put this in context, among the fastest growing kind of proportion of married women who are working women, are married women and married women with children under age 1. And so it's much more likely now that young women who are graduating from college will have very similar kind of work histories as men. We're also seeing a delayed and declining fertility and declining mortality. And so, for example, at the start of the century, families would have as many as 5 to 7 children, and now fertility levels are at around 2 replacement level, and the only reason that they're above replacement level is births from foreign-born people, foreign-born residents in the United States. The fertility is falling to below replacement levels for native white people. When you look at mortality, what's really striking is that we are seeing incredible gains in longevity. And so, for example, if they look at the total number of people that are alive right now, if we had not had the gains that we had in medical technologies since the mid part of the century, half of the people in the United States would not be alive right now. And so we've made enormous advances in our hygiene, in our well-being through nutrition, through vaccination, through medical technologies, and because of that, we're expanding our life course. Now, a lot of these gains are occurring at faster rates than even medical researchers had expected. So during the 80s and 90s, when they made predictions about how far longevity would increase, they were always being surpassed. But now they're kind of looking at younger generations and wondering whether their longevity will be as good as their parents and grandparents because of rising problems with obesity and lifestyle kind of choices. But anyway, I really want you to understand that at the start of the century, an average adult was lucky to live to be about 45 to 52 years old, and now our longevity is in the 80s. Okay, so what are kind of the implications overall for families? Well, there's been an overall decline in married couple families with children. So there's been a rise, in people not choosing to marry at all, right? And then there's also been a rise in the percentage of married couples who've chosen not to bear children. And so that's kind of like the changing tapestry of thinking about what the American family is. Whatever the American family is, married couples with children is a declining proportion of them. and that even if you look at for just families with children, there's been a decline in married couple to biological parent families. So what I mean by that is, so this idealistic model, kind of the um, leave it to beaver kind of model, where a man and a woman marry and then they have children biologically together, that's a decreasing proportion of children, families with children. So there's more children who are in single mother families, single father families, more children who are now in cohabiting families, and who maybe were born in a single mother family and then their parents started to cohabit. There are children who are kind of in blended families because of remarriage, that kind of thing. And so more and more children are experiencing a complexity of relationships rather than just being a two biological parent family. And along with this, something else to think about with families is that there's been an explosive growth in single person households. So, for example, I'm your professor. I've never been married and I never had children, and I own my own little home and have my garden, and so I'm a single person household. And so there's been enormous growth in that. And in fact, a lot of people who are in industries around real estate are trying to kind of take that into stock, like trying to think through how do we build houses for single person households, how do we think about retirement villages, that kind of thing. And so, what are the implications of these major trends? Well, there's been an overall growth in one or two person households as a total share of all households. And so, while children as a component of our households, children in residents and households, has been declining, we've kind of seen the rise of primary individuals. And by that I mean a primary individual who's a sole adult like myself, or maybe a cohabiting couple or a married couple who are without children. And there's been a decline in large households with many people and multiple generations. And so what we're seeing is that people are choosing to not live with their elder generations at a greater rate. And so because of our changes in pension systems and our Social Security a lot of elders have been able to kind of maintain their own independence or live in retirement communities or some sort of assisted residential living. And the middle generation has kind of gone along with that, one by choice and two by the elders' preference. And so we've seen kind of multi-generation households decreasing. Along with that, fewer people are having children, right? And so there's a decline in younger generations. And in fact, what's really interesting is that when you look at kind of the changing middle generation, any given uh, any given kid who's born to a middle generation is likely to have more parents and grandparents to ultimately take care of than they ever will have children. So I want you to think about that. That in the past, people were dying at relatively young ages, but they had relatively high fertility. So over the course of your life, you might have to take care of maybe an elderly grandma for a short period of time, but you were having 3 or 4 children. And now that's kind of shifting, that any grown adult is more likely to have more elderly people to have to take care of at some point in their life than they are going to have children. And so that's kind of an impact on the family. However, we have started to see kind of a shift in these statistics just slightly recently, because now what we're seeing is that for middle-aged people, young adults are now coming in and moving in with their families. And so young adults are leaving home at older ages, and they're more likely to return to those homes than they were in the past. Another big implication is that a lot of children are being born outside of marriage. And I know that you know this, but the statistics are really clear. Approximately 40% of all children are born outside of marriage in the United States. Now, this varies very dramatically by region. So, for example, in Detroit, the vast majority of children are born outside of marriage. In other kind of urban centers, that's also the case. When we look at that, though, and start parsing it out, we see that that doesn't mean necessarily that they're born to a single mother and then just raised with a single parent. About half of children who are being born outside of marriage are actually being born into cohabitations. And so their mother and father are together, they're just not married. Now, that people are trying to research this issue because we know that most cohabitations are pretty short-lived. And so that means that a child who's born into a cohabitation, they're going to see their parents either marry and then maybe marry and divorce, or they're going to see their parents break up. And so these children who are born in these kind of settings are likely to have a lot more life course transitions before they reach age 18. And so now family sociologists, like in my department, we're not just studying what are the consequences of marriage or divorce or cohabitation transitions for children. We're looking at family instability overall. And so we're looking at the consequences of are there increasing negative consequences for children as the number of transitions increase? Are there particular combinations that are more risky than others? Like if your parents divorce and then your mother doesn't remarry, but your father remarries and starts having other children with another woman, like what are the kind of combinations that may impact children? And so basically, family sociology is incredibly interesting right now. I want to look in particular at some specific phenomenon. And so the first thing I want to look at is delayed marriage. So we have seen recently, starting like in mid-century, but really increasing lately, a major postponement of marriage. And so marriage rates among young people have dropped by more than half. People are putting marriage to much later ages. They're kind of even choosing to have children before marriage. They're definitely needing to get more education. And so in the past, people were expecting maybe a high school degree before marriage, and now people are thinking that they're going to have to go beyond even a bachelor's. They have to get postgraduate education. And so anyway, young adults are delaying marriage, and by quite a lot. But they're not foregoing marriage, or at least they report that they want to marry. And so they do this monitoring the future survey each year, and time again, young people report that they see marriage as a goal in life and that's something that makes meaning in life. And the vast majority feel that way and are expecting to marry. And so they want to delay it but not forgo it completely. But the thing that's interesting is that demographers are showing that while they may be delaying marriage, they're not really changing the age at which they start really intimate relationships, sexual and romantic and committed relationships. But what's happening is that they're trading marriage for cohabitation. And so at younger ages, people are still forming unions. It's just that they're forming cohabitations and not marriage. Now, there's some really important race and ethnic differences in this. So, for example, while the vast majority, over 90% of whites are expected to marry, only around 67% of blacks are expected to marry. And part of that is because of kind of our prejudices about interracial marriage. Although there is a real significant growth in interracial marriage, there's still some prejudices about it. And there's also the impact of choices. Blacks maybe not wanting to marry at the same rate as whites. And then there's also kind of marriage market difficulties. So we remember in the unit that I was talking to you about the era of mass incarceration, it's really difficult to have kind of a stock of eligible people to marry when so many of them are kind of barred from stable employment and maybe have to pass through prisons. And so anyway, there's these important race ethnic differences. Now, I point this out to you because demographers who have studied this have shown that for black families, this is something that's been rather recent. So if you looked at post-slavery, so antebellum period, so after slaves were supposedly freed in the mid, 1867, there was a massive move throughout 19th and then the early 20th century to northern cities. Black families were really kind of reconstituting themselves. But even during this time period, no matter how poor they were, and in fact, in the 19th century, more than 90% of black families were poor. No matter if they were sharecroppers, urban factory workers, or urban residents, no matter where they were, the vast majority of adult blacks were married. And it was only until about the 1960s that we started seeing a rise in single motherhood and a rise in non-marriage among blacks, right? So that's sort of interesting. And so people who look at that are trying to figure out why is that occurring. And then two, are blacks kind of just ahead of the curve? Are whites and Hispanics and other groups going to pull away from marriage as well? Are we going to start seeing the rise of people not choosing marriage among other racial ethnic groups as well? So that's sort of an interesting phenomenon. So when we think about marriage, it's sort of interesting to think about the challenges to marriage that are out there in the United States right now. Many people kind of talk about marriage as an institution that's the bedrock of society, right? We think if you're Durkheimian and believe in functionalist theory, you're thinking that families are places and marriage is the most stable place in which to rear children and train young men to go out in the labor force and compete, and young women how to be nurturing and raise obedient and compliant citizens. And so if you're a Durkheimian, you kind of take a real gendered perspective about the use of the family in marriage. But generally, even if you don't have a Durkheimian perspective, we know that our policymakers have a lot of concern about marriages. And so what have we seen? Well, we've seen the rise in civil unions. So we've seen that as cohabitation's increased, a lot of civil union laws are being created. So lawyers are being asked to contract arrangements between non-married couples. City governments are often asked to provide benefits to city employees who are cohabiting, health benefits and other kind of benefits. Vermont, before we got marriage equality in 2015, Vermont was one of the early front runners of creating civil marriage or civil union rather than marriage for gay people. And so we had that kind of like an alternative, these legal alternatives to marriage. And then we also had cohabitation increasing, cohabitation even without regulation. And so those kinds of systems or those kinds of behaviors sort of challenge the traditional meaning of marriage, right? And so then you have to ask yourself, is cohabitation a component of the family system? If the majority of people are going to pass through cohabitation before they marry, is it a part of dating? Is it a part of marriage? How should we think of it? And so basically, a lot of sociologists are looking at marriage pluralism. And so, for example, in some states, there's multiple forms of legal marriage. There's some where you can have like no-fault divorce, so you marry and divorce if you want. There's others that if you get this particular kind of marriage called covenant marriage, it's harder to get into and you have to go through counseling. And if you want to get divorced, it's harder to get out of and you have to get counseling and prove fault. And so we're seeing like this marriage pluralism occur. And then in 2015, we saw the Supreme Court render a decision to make marriage equality part of the U.S. fabric, right? That lesbians and gays are permitted to marry. But what we've seen is that several states, especially like in Kentucky, there have been clerks of court who are challenging that, who are refusing to issue licenses and facing penalties. And so thinking about what marriage is to society is a lot more complicated and interesting now because of all these kind of variety of social ferment around it. All right, so let's talk about divorce in particular. So divorce rose steadily in the first half of the 20th century. And in fact, even before people were legally permitted to divorce, there were things like abandonment, that people would break up, men would maybe leave their wives, that kind of thing. And so we always did have family separation. It's just that legal divorce first started to increase slowly in the first half of the 20th century and then suddenly started to increase dramatically after 1967. And so one of the reasons they think, they cite that in the 1970s, most of the states, the vast majority of them had fault-based divorce. And so they usually had provisions like only the husband can ask for divorce or there can only be divorce if there's fault that they prove that someone was cheating and that they have kind of even detective photos. Like they had really extreme measures. It wasn't just irreconcilable differences. And so in 1970, California and then rapidly other states started passing no-fault divorce laws that permitted people to divorce if they felt that they were incompatible, irreconcilable differences, they just couldn't make it work out. And the vast majority of these states moved towards, instead of having to be agreed, both partners agree, you can file for unilateral divorce. So if you wanted to divorce your husband or wife, you could file and the divorce would be granted regardless of what your spouse wanted, right? And so some people look at that and they say that the laws changed because people had a pent-up need to divorce. There was a desire to divorce. There was changing attitudes. More and more people were thinking that it was worse for children to see unhappy parents or fighting parents than it was to stay together and let children be raised in a married family but in an unhappy family. And so some people say that the laws changed because people changed. But other people argue that if we hadn't changed those laws and made it so easy to divorce, maybe more people would have worked out their marriages and the divorce rate wouldn't have been so high. So regardless how you might feel about that, and there's research on both sides, in 1980, the divorce rate peaked in the United States, and it's been decreasing since then. It's gone down a little bit, but we are still substantially higher than other Western nations. And so even other nations that we think of as being pretty liberal, like Sweden, we have higher divorce rates than they do. And we think that maybe divorce didn't go down just because people are turning away in their attitudes about divorce, that they're thinking more negatively about it, but instead it's because of the changing composition of the population. And so if people get married at older ages, divorce rate goes down because, age is associated with divorce. People who get married at young ages have higher rates of divorce. And so it might be something about the age at marriage having an impact on this. Now, some people have really, really interesting ideas about, why divorce is kind of a part of the American system now. If you think about people out in the world, so in the 1950s, if you're thinking about adults and you're out and about shopping in stores or working, going to church, the vast majority of adults that you would talk to in any given day are married, right? So you talk to married people. Now, as we have divorce rates increasing, if you think about 1,000 married people in the population, there's been an increase in the number of divorced people per 1,000. And so now practically 1 out of every 4 people that you bump into is going to be a divorced person or have experience as a divorce, right? And so that means that if you're complaining about your spouse at the water cooler at work and you're talking about a problem or just kind of thinking out loud, you're less likely to bump into people who tell you to work it out because they're married, and more likely than in the past to bump into somebody who's been through a divorce, been through what you've been going through, and encourages you to think about divorce and gives you advice about what lawyer and things to use, right? And so some people argue that we've kind of made procedures and made things easier. We've changed the attitudes towards divorce in that way. But at any rate, something else that's really interesting in our department is that Dr. Ethan Lin and Susan Brown, they've been studying divorce and cohabitation among elderly people, so baby boomers, people age 50 and older. And what they've shown is that there's been this really explosive growth in cohabitation. And so a lot more baby boomers are choosing to either, cohabit rather than remarry if a spouse dies. And that there has been an enormous growth in divorce. So among people age 50 and older, there's been a big spike in divorce rates. And so people look at that and they say that this is of concern because, one, are baby boomers setting themselves up for kind of late life unhappiness, that they don't have a partner? And two, are they kind of weakening or diffusing their resources? They're having to split up resources because of divorce. And so especially divorced women in their old age, is this going to have an impact on our social welfare state? Anyway, this research has been in the Wall Street Journal, NPR, and New York Times. It's been everywhere. It's been a big deal. They've been working on this for the past 2 years or so. Okay, so let's think about divorce and remarriage. Okay, these two stats you're going to really have to know for the exam. 45 to 50% of first marriages are expected to end in divorce. So that means if you're going to enter a marriage for the very first time, right, you have like a 50% chance of that marriage lasting a lifetime. And so that seems like a relatively high rate, right? But the divorce rate for remarriages is even higher. So about 2 out of 3 remarriages will end up in divorce. And so that's been pretty fairly consistent. Now, what I think is sort of interesting is when you think about marriage and divorce together. So I want to talk about race-ethnic differences. So blacks are less likely to marry, right? And so in some sense they're disadvantaged because they don't get the benefits of marriage, if there are benefits to marriage. But if they're going to divorce, what's interesting is that they're much more likely to be in a long period of separation before they divorce than are whites. That whites generally, they separate and then they relatively move quickly to either getting a divorce or working it out and making the marriage work. And so blacks tend to be in a separated state for 7 years longer than whites before they divorce. And researchers are suspecting that one of the reasons is because they really don't have that many assets. They're at a disadvantage. They don't have assets that they really can split apart together. And then two, that because of this long delay, they're also disadvantaged in kind of recovering. They don't get an opportunity to maybe remarry and recoup assets that way. And so even in divorce, there's inequalities by race. But when we think about remarriage, what I think is really interesting is that the reason for remarriage has really shifted over the century. So in the past, at the start of the 20th century, the reason you're getting remarried is because your partner died, right? Divorce rates were low, there aren't single parents, that kind of thing. That the reason you have to remarry is your partner died. And then, starting in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, we started seeing that the reasons people needed to remarry is divorce. And in fact, divorce has now far surpassed widowhood as a reason that people are remarrying. Okay? And so people are also kind of choosing, when we think about remarriage, a lot more are choosing cohabitation rather than remarrying. And then a lot of people are choosing to delay remarrying. So when they divorce, they're not necessarily as excited to more rapidly move into another marriage. So we've got some really changing trends that way. And in fact, thinking about this kind of shifting over the century, I want to talk about single parenthood. What are the reasons for single parenthood? So at the start of the century, the major reason for single parenthood, again, was widowhood, right? And then in mid-century, the large reason for single parenthood is divorce. And now, the most significant reason for single parenthood is because people are having children outside of marriage. And so we've really seen a shift, a movement away of children, childbearing, and marriage. Okay, so what does this mean for marriage? There's these two big debates in family sociology. One is some people are arguing that we're seeing the deinstitutionalization of marriage, that we no longer have kind of language to talk about these changing family forms. How do we talk about stepmothers? How do we talk about stepfathers? How do we talk about our step siblings, our half siblings? How do we talk about if our father remarries someone and has a half sibling, but you want to have a relationship with the half sibling, but not the other children who are born to the stepmother? Like, we have this complicated language now about families and marriage. And that we are also seeing complications in law. The states really differ on how they treat step families, what they expect of cohabiting parents, that you, depending on what state you're in, are going to face different kinds of laws. And that our culture maybe is not catching up with these trends, that we're really not sure how to handle this. And so, some people say that therefore marriage is in trouble, it's strained, it's not able to meet American needs. Other people look at it and they argue that no, it's just the rise of alternative families, that we're seeing a diversification of family forms and family choices, and that as long as we take care of families who are in poverty or who have special needs, we don't necessarily need to worry about whether they're having their family life within a marriage or not. So those are like the polar debates about it. Among those who would like to reinstitutionalize marriage, like make marriage a primary institution that people enter in and that they never leave, and that most people feel the desire to be in, they argue that we should reinstitutionalize marriage. Some people argue for society's well-being, and then others argue that marriage, regardless of what people want, marriage might be better for children's well-being. And so you see some states that are trying to reinstitutionalize it. So, for example, some states will pay for your marriage license if you go through premarital counseling. Some states are trying to make two forms of marriage to make it a little bit harder to get into and require people to get counseling, that kind of thing. And so we're kind of seeing, like, what can we do to improve marriage overall? And the research is kind of unclear about whether any of those efforts are working or not. Okay, so the last few things I want to talk about are specifically about young people, so people who are in their young adult years. There's this really famous demographer called Ronald Rinfus, and he developed this term called demographic density. And what he meant by that is the young adult years are really dense years, that when you look at the types of transitions people do, they do enormous numbers of them in a really tight period of time, really dense number of transitions. So young people are finishing school, getting jobs, losing jobs, beginning families, choosing alternative living regimens, living with friends, living with cohabiting partners, getting more training, maybe joining the military, maybe entering marriage, getting divorced, moving to another state for a job. That your choices are these rich tapestry of choices. As compared to me, I'm 53. I can't remember when the last time I did a transition that a demographer would count. So I've lived in the same house for over 17 years. I've worked in the same job for 17 years. I haven't cohabited or married. I didn't have children. So I'm pretty boring to a demographer, but you are pretty interesting. And there's a researcher called Paul Amato that he says that what's interesting is that your life courses have become a lot more complex than previous generations. So in the past, it really was the case that the majority of people would finish high school, get a job, maybe go to school, but definitely get married, and then have children. So those were the four things: finish school, get a job, get married, have children. Mostly in that order, right? Now there's at least 7 major kind of patterns with a whole bunch of sub-patterns. So there's a pattern where you graduate from high school, finish college, get a job, get married, have children. There's the pattern of graduate from high school, get a job, cohabit, and have children. There's a pattern of, all sorts of things, including a pattern of young adults who didn't complete school and don't have a job and are not seemingly doing anything, right? And so demographers are trying to piece out what are the reasons for these different patterns. Okay, so I think you'll remember that in the first week I had you read 2 policy family profiles from the National Center for Family and Marriage Research. And they were talking about how your millennial generation is different from other generations. And so you're less likely to be married now, although you're working as much as past generations. And you're less likely to be living with children now, your own biological children, at this age than previous generations were. But something else that's really interesting about your generation is that, you are kind of reversing trends of previous generations in terms of parental, how you are with your parents. The Pew Research Center and other research organizations are showing that as a generation, you tend to have better relationships with your parents than previous generations, that you're reporting that you feel closer to your parents than previous generations did. And so you're reporting that you're less likely to want to leave your parental home. And so many of you are staying in your parental home and choosing to do so, one, to be close to your parents, but also to pay off school debts and or prepare for other major life debts that are coming up, like trying to save up to buy a house or something, right? And so your age at leaving your parental home is increasing as compared to previous generations. And then not only that, but it looks like you're having a lot more kind of a boomerang effect. That when you finally do leave home, a lot more of you are coming home to live with your parents again. And to come home quite a few times. And so not just returning home once, to relaunch, but maybe touching base with the parental home a few more times than that. And so demographers are trying to understand how do the generations feel about that. A lot of the research is showing that the middle generation doesn't mind and they approve and they like being with their young adults. Other research shows that it's a strain on the middle generation because they're targeting more resources and assets downstream to their adult children rather than kind of saving them up for their own retirement. Other research shows that young adults, by doing this, it may be a buffer economically, but it might be delaying other family trends. And so it's kind of an interesting phenomenon to look at. It looks positive in some ways and then maybe troublesome in others. That's it for the family chapter. I sure hope you enjoy the videos and readings I've selected.